My name is Raymond Pruitt, and I am 69 years old, and I spent 31 years as an insurance investigator, and I want you to understand something about that profession before I tell you what my stepdaughter did. Because insurance investigation is not about catching people lying the way most people. Assume it is about pattern recognition and the distance between what a person says and what the evidence shows, and I spent 3 decades measuring that distance professionally, and I was very good at it, and I did not expect to need that skill inside my own family, but that is exactly where this story ends up. And I want to start by telling you about my stepdaughter Renata, because context is everything, and Renata came into my life when she was 14 years old, and I married her mother Gloria, and Renata was not easy, and I did not expect her to be, because 14 is a difficult age under the best circumstances, and losing your father at 11 makes it more difficult, and I tried with Renata the way you try, with a child who has decided in advance that you are the enemy I showed, up to her school events, and I learned her favorite foods, and I drove her to practice without being asked, and she tolerated me the way teenagers tolerate most things, which is minimally and with visible effort, and by the time she was 22, she had stopped tolerating me altogether. Gloria died of a stroke 4 years into our marriage, and after the funeral.
Renata looked at me across the kitchen of the house Gloria and I had shared, and she said, "This is my mother's house now." And I said, "Renata, your mother and I had a will." And she said, "I know about the will." And she said, "It's the way people say things when they have already decided. The conversation is over," and I let it go because I was grieving. And
because grief makes you accommodate things you should not accommodate, and the house was in both our names as it turned out, because Gloria had been careful that way, so Renata moved in, and I stayed, and we lived in a careful silence for 2 years that was not peaceful. It was simply the absence of open conflict, and during those 2 years I noticed things the way I had always noticed things. Renata received phone calls she took in other rooms, and the calls made her nervous in the specific way that people are nervous when they are managing information, and she had a visitor on Tuesday evenings, a man named Curtis, who drove a truck without of state plates and left before midnight, and I filed all of it away the way I had filed things for 31 years, and then in October I had a cardiac event, nothing dramatic. By the time I reached the hospital, it was being described as a significant episode, and I was admitted, and I stayed for 4 days, and during those 4 days, Renata did not come, and she did not call, and the nurse on the second evening asked if there was family she should contact, and I gave her my brother Leonard's number in Charlotte, and Leonard drove up the next morning and sat beside my bed and said, "Raymond, what is going on in that house?" And I told him, and Leonard listened without interrupting the way Leonard had always listened. And when I finished, he said, "I think you already know what you need to do." And I said I do, and I did, because I had known for a while I simply had not been ready. And Leonard brought my laptop to the hospital, and I made 3 phone calls from my hospital bed, and the first call was to my attorney David, who had handled my affairs for 20 years, and the second call was to a private investigator named Sheila, who had worked cases for my firm before I retired, and the third call was to a records office in a county 2 states away, and Sheila came back to me in 6 days with a folder, and the folder told a story that I had suspected the shape of but not the specific details, and the specific details were this. Curtis, whose last name was Merritt, had an active warrant in Georgia for. Fraud and Renata had known Curtis for 3 years, which was 1 year. Before Gloria died, and Renata had been the named beneficiary on a life, insurance policy I had not known existed a policy taken out on my life 18 months earlier with a signature on the application that my investigator confirmed was not mine and I sat in my living room with.
That folder on my lap, and I thought about 31 years of measuring the distance between what people say and what the evidence shows, and I thought about Renata not coming to the hospital, and I thought about the out-of-state plates on Curtis Merritt's truck, and I called David and I said, David, I need you to come to the house and bring a notary, and David
came the next afternoon, and we spent 3 hours at my kitchen table, and when he left, I had done 2 things. The first was restructure every financial document attached to my name, and the second was provide Sheila's complete file, including the fraudulent insurance application, to the state, Insurance Fraud Division, which is the division I had worked alongside for most of my career, and which I knew would move quickly on what I was, giving them, and I did not tell Renata any of this, and I continued living. In the house quietly the way I had lived there for 2 years and 6, weeks later on a Thursday evening, Renata came home from wherever she had been and found 2 investigators from the fraud division sitting in the living room, and Curtis Merritt's name was on a warrant that had been upgraded to include insurance fraud conspiracy, and Renata sat down very slowly in the chair across from me and looked at me, and I looked back at her, and I thought about 14-year-old Renata tolerating me at the dinner table, and I thought about the hospital room where no one came, and I thought about Gloria, who had been careful enough to put both our names on the house deed. And I said, Renata, I spent 31 years finding things that people tried to hide. And I said it quietly, because I did not need to say it loudly, and the investigators did the rest, and the fraudulent policy was voided, and the warrant for Curtis Merritt was executed, and Renata faced charges she eventually pleaded down to a suspended sentence and community service, and I still live in the house, the one with Gloria's name on the deed beside mine, and I still have coffee in the morning in the kitchen where David and I sat for 3 hours, and I think about pattern recognition sometimes, and the distance between what people say and what the evidence shows, and if someone in your life is showing you a pattern, I want you to hear this: the evidence is already there. You simply have to be willing to measure the distance and act on what you find.